The autumn morning mist clung to the perimeter fence of Fort Blackwood like ghostly fingers, reluctant to surrender to the pale sunlight creeping across the military compound. Margaret Chun shuffled through the dissipating fog, her worn sneakers making soft scuffing sounds against the asphalt. The weight of her cleaning supplies pulled at her shoulders, a battered mop bucket in one hand, a canvas bag stuffed with rags and bottles in the other. Her gray hair, streaked with silver and pulled back in a loose bun, caught the early light as she approached the main gate. Private First Class Derek Jackson stood at attention beside the security checkpoint, his uniform crisp and his boots polished to mirror brightness. At 22, he carried himself with the rigid confidence of someone eager to prove his worth. This was his first week on gate duty at one of the military's most sensitive installations, and he'd been briefed extensively about the importance of maintaining absolute security protocols. Today was different. Today, there would be high-ranking officials from multiple branches conducting classified briefings about emerging threats in the Pacific Theater. Margaret paused at the outer perimeter, fishing through her bag with arthritic fingers that seemed to struggle with the simple task of finding her identification. The delay irritated Jackson, who had already processed a dozen personnel that morning, each with proper clearance and purpose. He watched her with growing impatience as she mumbled to herself, dropping a cleaning rag that fluttered to the ground like a surrendering flag. "Ma'am," Jackson called out, his voice carrying the authority he'd been taught to project. "Please have your identification ready and state your business." Margaret looked up, her brown eyes appearing watery behind wire-rimmed glasses that had seen better decades. "Oh, hello there, young man. I'm here to clean the administrative building." "Same as always." Her voice carried a slight tremor, the kind that comes with age and years of hard work. Jackson examined the ID card she finally produced, a standard contractor badge with her photo, name, and basic clearance level. But something was wrong. The card lacked the special holographic seal required for today's security level. And more importantly, her name wasn't on his authorized personnel list. He'd memorized every name, every face, every clearance level for today's operations. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back. This facility is under enhanced security protocols today. No unauthorized personnel are permitted entry." Jackson's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, a gesture drilled into him during countless hours of training. Margaret's expression shifted to one of confused concern. "But I've been cleaning these buildings for 15 years, dear. I know every corner, every office." General Morrison specifically requested that the conference rooms be spotless for today's meetings. She took a small step forward, her bucket scraping against the concrete. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there." Jackson's voice hardened, drawing the attention of Sergeant Williams, who was conducting a vehicle inspection nearby. "I don't care how long you've worked here. Today's different. No exceptions." The morning air grew tense as other personnel began to notice the commotion. A group of junior officers paused their conversation to watch the standoff between the young guard and the elderly cleaning woman. Some exchanged amused glances. The sight of a soldier being so rigid with a harmless old lady struck them as unnecessarily dramatic. Margaret's shoulders sagged slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on Jackson's face. "Son, I understand you're doing your job, but I have my own job to do. Those conference rooms won't clean themselves. And if they're not ready when the brass arrives," she let the implication hang in the air, "that's not my problem." "Lady," Jackson's patience was wearing thin. He'd been warned about people who might try to exploit sympathy or familiarity to gain unauthorized access. "You need proper clearance for today, and you don't have it." End of discussion. Sergeant Williams approached, his weathered face showing mild curiosity. "What's the situation, Jackson?" "Cleaning lady trying to enter without proper authorization, Sergeant. She claims she's been working here for years." but her clearance isn't sufficient for today's security level. Williams glanced at Margaret, taking in her humble appearance and the genuine confusion in her expression. "Ma'am, I'm sure you understand we have to follow protocols. Perhaps you could contact your supervisor and have them verify your authorization?" Margaret shifted her weight, the bucket handle creaking under the strain. "My supervisor is already inside, preparing for the day. I tried calling, but you know how these old buildings of self-service is terrible." She gestured toward the imposing concrete structure behind the gates. "Look," Jackson interjected, his frustration mounting, "I don't care if you're Mother Teresa herself. Without proper clearance, you're not getting through this gate." That's final. The small crowd of onlookers had grown, and Margaret could feel their eyes on her. Some showed sympathy for her plight, while others seemed to enjoy the entertainment of watching a young soldier flex his authority over a defenseless old woman. The weight of their stares seemed to press down on her shoulders, making her appear even more frail and vulnerable. "Please," Margaret said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that made several observers shift uncomfortably. "I just need to do my job. I've never caused any trouble. I know this place better than most of the people who work here." Jackson's jaw tightened. He'd been specifically warned about manipulation tactics, about how enemies of the state might use seemingly innocent covers to gain access to sensitive areas. The fact that she knew the layout so well only made him more suspicious. "Ma'am, for the last time, you need to leave this area immediately. If you continue to persist, I'll have to call for backup and potentially place you under detention for attempting to breach a secure facility." The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret's hands, which had been trembling slightly from the weight of her supplies, suddenly steadied. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, a flash of steel that seemed completely at odds with her frail appearance. But it passed so quickly that Jackson, focused on asserting his authority, missed it entirely. "You would arrest an old woman for trying to do her job?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Sergeant Williams take a closer look at her. "I would arrest anyone who threatens the security of this installation," Jackson replied firmly, his hand now resting openly on his weapon. "Age doesn't grant you special privileges to ignore military protocol." The standoff stretched on, neither party willing to back down. Margaret stood her ground with a quiet dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, while Jackson maintained his rigid adherence to regulations. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist and casting sharp shadows across the compound dot in the distance. The sound of heavy doors opening echoed across the courtyard, but Jackson was too focused on the confrontation to notice. Margaret, however, tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something specific. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, so brief and subtle that it might have been a trick of the light. The tension in the air was about to shatter in ways that none of the gathered personnel could possibly imagine. The heavy steel doors of the administrative building exploded outward with such force that they slammed against the concrete walls, the metallic crash reverberating across the entire compound like a gunshot. Every head in the courtyard snapped toward the sound, conversations dying mid-sentence as a figure emerged from the building's shadowed interior. General Robert Morrison burst through the doorway with the urgency of a man whose world was collapsing around him. His usually immaculate uniform was disheveled, his tie askew, and his silver hair, normally combed to perfection, stuck up at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it in desperation. The 4 stars on his shoulders caught the morning sunlight as he stumbled slightly, regaining his balance before breaking into a full sprint across the courtyard dot behind him. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Hayes, struggled to keep pace while clutching a red folder marked with multiple classification stamps. Her face was flushed with exertion and what appeared to be barely controlled panic. "Sir, wait," she called out, her voice cracking with strain. "We need to coordinate with security first." But Morrison wasn't listening. His eyes had locked onto the scene at the main gate, and his expression transformed through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, recognition, and then absolute horror. The blood drained from his weathered face as the full implications of what he was witnessing crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Dear God, no," he roared, his voice carrying across the compound with such force that windows seemed to rattle in their frames. "Stand down! Everybody stand down right now." Private Jackson spun around, his hand still resting on his sidearm, completely bewildered by the general's apparent hysteria. The young soldier had never seen a flag officer lose composure like this, and for a moment, he wondered if the stress of command had finally broken the old man's mind. Sergeant Williams stepped back instinctively, his military training recognizing the tone of absolute authority even when he couldn't understand the reason behind it. Morrison's polished dress shoes pounded against the asphalt as he covered the distance between the building and the gate with surprising speed for a man in his 60s. His aides struggled behind him, the classified folder clutched against her chest like a shield, her own face reflecting the same mixture of urgency and terror that had consumed her commanding officer. The growing crowd of onlookers pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle of their base commander apparently losing his mind over a confrontation with a cleaning lady. Junior officers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. Some pulled out their phones, instinctively documenting what they assumed would become legendary base gossip. "Sir, what's the situation?" Sergeant Williams called out as Morrison approached, but the general didn't even acknowledge him. His entire focus was fixed on the elderly woman standing calmly beside her mop bucket, watching his approach with an expression that seemed almost amused. Morrison skidded to a halt just 3 feet from Margaret, his chest heaving from the sprint and the adrenaline coursing through his system. For a moment, he stood there gasping, his eyes wide with something that looked remarkably like fear. Then, with movements that seemed to surprise even himself, he snapped to the most perfect military attention anyone present had ever witnessed. His spine straightened like a steel rod, his shoulders squared with parade ground precision, and his right hand flew to his temple in a salute so crisp and sharp it could have cut glass. The transformation was instantaneous and complete from panicked commander to subordinate soldier in the space of a heartbeat. "Colonel Chun, ma'am." Morrison's voice cracked slightly on the words, but the respect and deference in his tone was unmistakable. "I offer my most sincere and abject apologies for this catastrophic breach of protocol." The effect on the gathered crowd was electric. Conversation stopped mid-word, phones were lowered in shock, and every person within earshot felt their understanding of reality shift beneath their feet. Private Jackson's mouth fell open, his hand dropping away from his weapon as if it had suddenly become red-hot. The confident young soldier, who had been so certain of his authority moments before, now looked like a child who had just realized he'd been playing with dynamite. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes finally caught up. Her breathing labored and her face flushed. She took one look at the scene, a commanding general saluting a cleaning lady, and her own face went pale. The classified folder in her hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as the implications of the situation became clear. "Ma'am," Hayes managed to gasp out, her voice barely above a whisper, "we had no idea you were. We weren't informed that you were." Margaret Chen stood perfectly still, allowing the moment to stretch out like a taut wire. The morning sun illuminated her weathered features, and for the first time, the observers began to notice details they had missed before. The way she held herself, despite her apparent frailty, the sharpness in her eyes that seemed to cut through the confusion around her, the subtle confidence in her posture that spoke of someone accustomed to command. Sergeant Williams felt his knees go weak as pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed began falling into place. He'd been in the military for 23 years, had served in 3 combat zones, and had never seen any general show this level of deference to anyone below the rank of 4 stars. Yet here was Morrison, one of the most decorated officers in the Army, saluting an elderly cleaning woman with the kind of respect usually reserved for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The crowd pressed closer, their whispers growing louder as they tried to process what they were witnessing. Some of the junior officers began to recognize that they were seeing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. Others simply stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to reconcile the humble cleaning lady with the obvious reverence she was commanding from the base's highest ranking. Officer Private Jackson felt the world spinning around him as the full weight of his mistake began to settle on his shoulders. His throat went dry, and his hands began to shake as he realized that he had just spent the last 20 minutes threatening and humiliating someone who apparently outranked everyone on the base. The confident young soldier who had been so certain of his protocols and procedures now felt like he was drowning in his own ignorance. Margaret's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in their shocked faces and confused expressions with the calm assessment of someone who had spent decades reading people and situations. Her gaze lingered for a moment on Private Jackson, and something in her expression, not quite sympathy, but not condemnation either, made the young man's stomach clench with dread. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of traffic beyond the base perimeter and the soft whisper of wind through the chain-link fence. Everyone present seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for someone to explain how their understanding of the world had just been turned completely upside down. Finally, Margaret Chun moved. It was a small gesture, just a slight shift in her posture, but it seemed to break the spell that had frozen everyone in place. The transformation was about to begin. Margaret Chun's transformation began with her hands. The arthritic trembling that had made her seem so frail suddenly ceased, her fingers straightening with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades handling weapons and classified documents. She set down her mop bucket with deliberate care, the simple action somehow carrying the weight of ceremony. As if she were laying down a disguise that had served its purpose, her spine began to straighten, vertebra by vertebra, like a flower turning toward the sun. The stooped shoulders that had suggested years of menial labor squared themselves with military bearing that spoke of command, presence earned through blood and sacrifice. Her weathered face, which moments before had seemed merely tired and confused, now revealed the sharp intelligence that had been hiding behind her carefully constructed mask. "At ease, General Morrison," Margaret said, her voice no longer carrying the tremulous quality of age, but instead resonating with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The transformation in her vocal tone was so complete that several onlookers actually stepped backward, as if they were witnessing some form of supernatural metamorphosis. Morrison's salute snapped down, but his posture remained rigidly respectful. "Ma'am, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this security failure. If I had known you were conducting operations today, you weren't supposed to know." "Robert," Margaret interrupted gently, using his first name with the casual familiarity of someone who had earned that right through shared dangers and mutual respect. That was rather the point of the exercise. She turned her attention to the growing crowd of stunned personnel, her gaze sweeping across their faces with the practiced assessment of a career intelligence officer. When her eyes found Private Jackson, who stood frozen in a mixture of terror and disbelief, her expression softened slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard, "allow me to properly introduce myself. I am Colonel Margaret Chun, United States Army Intelligence, currently assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Special Activities Division. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like the sound of a dam beginning to crack. Junior officers exchanged glances of pure amazement, while senior NCOs began to piece together implications that made their blood run cold. Someone in the back whispered, "Special Activities Division," and the words seemed to echo with ominous significance. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her face still pale but her professional composure beginning to reassert itself. "Ma'am, your cover identity was so complete that even our security briefings made no mention of your presence. How long have you been operating under this persona?" Margaret's smile was enigmatic, carrying hints of secrets that would never be fully revealed. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Colonel Hayes, during which time I have had unrestricted access to every building on this base, every conversation in the break rooms, every piece of gossip that flows through the enlisted ranks. The implications hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Sergeant Williams felt his stomach drop as he realized that this unassuming cleaning lady had been present during countless conversations that should never have taken place in front of civilian contractors. How many classified discussions had she overheard? How many security protocols had been inadvertently revealed in her presence? The mission, Margaret continued, reaching into her canvas bag with movements that were now precise and purposeful, was to identify and neutralize a network of foreign intelligence operatives who had successfully infiltrated multiple levels of this installation's command structure. She withdrew what appeared to be a standard cleaning spray bottle, but her fingers found a hidden switch that caused the bottom to slide away, revealing sophisticated electronic equipment that pulsed with soft blue light. The device looked like something from a science fiction movie, all sleek surfaces and incomprehensible displays. "This facility has been hemorrhaging classified information for the past 18 months, Margaret explained, her voice taking on the crisp efficiency of a briefing officer. Satellite imagery, troop movements, weapon specifications, communication protocols, all finding their way to hostile foreign governments through a carefully constructed network of compromised personnel." Private Jackson felt his legs go weak. The woman he had been threatening to arrest was apparently one of the military's most elite operatives, conducting a counterintelligence operation of staggering complexity. His mind raced back through every interaction he'd witnessed between Margaret and other base personnel, suddenly seeing them in an entirely new light. "The beauty of the cleaning lady cover," Margaret continued, seemingly reading his thoughts, "is that people become invisible when they're perceived as harmless and beneath notice. I've been present for conversations between officers who would never dream of discussing classified matters in front of someone they considered a peer. I've had access to offices and documents that would be impossible to reach through conventional intelligence gathering." General Morrison's face had regained some of its color, but his expression remained deeply troubled. "Ma'am, what can you tell us about the scope of the compromise?" Margaret's expression grew grave. "Substantial, General. The network included 2 field-grade officers, 1 senior NCO, and 3 civilian contractors with high-level clearances. They've been feeding information to a foreign intelligence service for over 2 years." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. The idea that their own colleagues, people they worked alongside every day, had been betraying their country was almost too much to process. Some faces showed anger, others fear, and a few displayed the sick realization that they might have unknowingly contributed to the security breach. "However," Margaret continued, raising her voice to cut through the murmur, "as of this morning, the entire network has been neutralized. The arrests were coordinated to coincide with today's security briefing, ensuring that all suspects would be present on base." She turned back to Private Jackson, who stood transfixed like a deer in headlights. Private Jackson, your adherence to security protocols this morning was exemplary. You followed your orders precisely, even when faced with pressure and manipulation. That kind of discipline is exactly what prevented this security breach from becoming even worse. Jackson's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He had expected court-martial and disgrace, not commendation from a legendary intelligence officer. The real test, Margaret explained to the assembled crowd, wasn't whether you would recognize me or grant me special privileges. It was whether you would maintain security discipline even when it seemed unreasonable or harsh. Private Jackson passed that test with flying colors. She picked up her mop bucket, but now the simple cleaning supplies seemed like props in an elaborate theater production. The mission is complete, but the work of protecting this installation continues. Every one of you plays a vital role in that security, whether you're a general or a private, whether you're cleaning floors or commanding divisions. As Margaret walked toward the administrative building, her posture now unmistakably that of a senior military officer, the crowd parted before her like water. Private Jackson watched her go, still struggling to process the fact that he had just witnessed one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in military history. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of mist, but the events at Fort Blackwood's main gate would be remembered and retold for decades to come. A reminder that in the world of military intelligence, nothing is ever quite what it seems.